We moved in here in 2007, and every time that I have filled in on Wednesday night, I did a little bit of the book of Acts. And then, lo and behold, last year, I finished the book of Acts and scratched my head as to what I was going to do. And then it occurred to me, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, wrote 2 books, so I'll do the other one. I realize in kind of backward order by doing the first one last, but nevertheless, the Gospel of Luke is unique, not just in the New Testament, but in the whole Bible. It's the only book that's not written by a Jewish person. Now, not that makes a great deal of difference, but I would venture to guess that would put him in the same category as all of us. He was a Gentile. Luke was also a person who never met Jesus. The book of Mark is the Gospel of Peter, written down by Mark. Peter obviously met Jesus. Matthew met Jesus. John met Jesus. But this Gospel is written by someone who never did. He was a protege of the Apostle Paul, and the church from earliest times have believed the words he wrote down were inspired and inspected by that Apostle Paul. So in many ways, the Gospel of Luke is the gospel that Paul would have taught. So Luke writes this gospel down, and he begins after a brief introduction by reminding us of an amazing couple of things that God does to usher in what we call the New Testament. The Old Testament had ended 400 years before with Malachi, and then there was no more word from God, no prophets, no one to give the people who were yearning for a sign from God another sign. And people were anxious to know what would happen because they had gone through so much. About 100 years ago, if you had been in any small town or large town in America, there would be a morning that you would wake up, and on every telephone pole, on every barn, in every shop window would be a poster that the circus was coming to town. And before television, before the internet, before radio, there was nothing more exciting to the average person than the circus and the exotic animals, the highly trained acrobats. It was everything coming to town. And the circus made sure that they sent advance people out before to get the people ready, to whet their appetite, to know that it was coming and get them ready for that excitement. If you have the opportunity to go to Hollywood or New York City and see any live TV show taped, they will warm up the crowd, most often with a comedian. They'll get you primed and ready to go. And before the Messiah is going to come in the New Testament, there needs to be someone to get the people ready, to announce that this great 400 years of silence is over. The analogy is very much like in medieval times when a herald would go before a king and let the people know the king is coming. Pay attention. Get excited. Now, the way God chooses to do this is a way I honestly would never have thought of. He will cause the miraculous birth of 2 babies, one that is just highly unlikely, and the other one that is just impossible. Nothing but a miracle. But that's the way the gospel is going to start out. And we start with the herald, with the first one, with John. And it says here in the book of Luke, 1 verse 5, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Luke starts out by saying this occurred within living memory of most of the people reading. How many of you remember the year 1960? I mean, remember it. I was born in 1959. I don't remember it. But if you remember 1960, then you would be in the same position as most of the people when this gospel begins. They were old enough to remember 60 years ago when their nation had been independent, when their nation had been free. But they were old enough to remember when the Romans had taken it over. And the Romans had farmed out the job of ruling their nation to a man named Herod. like them, a person who would do whatever it took, knock a few heads, kill a few people in order to keep the peace. And it was during this time of Herod, when a great many people were unhappy, that a priest named Zechariah begins our story. He belonged to the division of Abijah, and he had a wife named Elizabeth, who, unusually enough, was also descended from the priestly lineage of Aaron. Luke says both of them, Zechariah and Elizabeth, were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Well, that's nice, but that's very important to know for Luke's audience. Because they were childless, and because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. You see, if you were childless, then most people at the time figured you were under a curse. There are still Christians today that will teach you that the bad things that happen to you are because God doesn't like you. You're poor, you got sick, you were the victim of crime, a storm blew away your house. That's all because God doesn't like you in the view of some people. And for the average Jew, if you and your wife had no children, then it must be an indication God had cursed you and your family. Because in that day and time, you had to have children. My great-grandmother had 13 kids. My grandfather had 4 children. My dad had 3. I had 3. My oldest son has 1. You can see the direction this is going. Children are becoming more and more an option, a choice. But if you lived back then, you had to have children to have someone take care of you in your old age. And without children, things would get kind of dicey, depending on how nice of relatives you had. Some rabbis even went so far as to say, if your wife cannot give you children, then divorce her, kick her to the curb. But clearly, Zechariah loved Elizabeth, and they had lived a long time together as husband and wife and loved each other. Now, it says that he was a part of the division of Abijah, which doesn't mean anything to us, but here's what you have to understand. When the temple was built during the days of Solomon, when it was first built, there were probably 800 priests. And so over the course of a couple of years, everybody gets a turn. Now, there are almost, if you do the math, 24 divisions, 830 each, that's almost exactly 20,000 priests. So many hundreds of years later, so many generations later, you've got 20,000 guys who want to serve in the temple. And in a Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, you're talking about 354 days a year. How many opportunities would you have in your lifetime to serve in the temple if you were one of 20,000? Well, somebody did the math, and it figured that your likelihood of serving in the temple, by the way, these 24 different courses of priests each served 2 weeks a year. In Abijah, you served 1 week in June and 1 week in November, according to our calendar. And your chance of being able to serve not just around the temple, but I'm talking about go inside the holy place of God was about 1.6%. In fact, most priests spent their whole lives praying that they would be chosen and be able to go into the temple of God. What a marvelous thing. And most of them never did. And so it was with great solemnity that priests would be chosen. Well, how did they choose them? It says, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot. He literally won the lottery, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. Now, are you serious? They stacked up these 830 priests of Abijah and then drew straws? Well, kind of. They cast lots of some kind or another, and it was based on this verse in Proverbs 16 and verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And so they believed when they cast the lot into the lap, whatever they chose, that person had been chosen by God. What did it look like? Nobody's quite sure. Little stones with symbols on them. We don't know, but it was based in part on the Old Testament high priesthood. The high priest of God had a robe and a fancy thing over that called an ephod, and then a metal breastplate with 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And behind the breastplate, he had 2 stones, Urim and Thummim. Now, what did they do and what did they mean? Nobody is exactly sure, but it seems that these stones basically were yes and no. And so when the priest would reach in behind his breastplate for some very important thing, he would pull one out, and that would be considered the will of God. Now, that may seem very odd to you, kind of a chancy way to live, but they believed it at the time as the way to find the will of God. In fact, the apostles in the very first chapter of the book of Acts decide on who will replace Judas, who has killed himself, to become the 12th apostle by this very same method. Luke writes, so they nominated 2 men, Joseph called Barsabbas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. Then they prayed, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which of these 2 you have chosen to take over this apostolic ministry, which Judas left to go where he belongs. Then they cast lots, and the lot fell to Matthias, so he was added to the 11 apostles. Now, I know what you're thinking. How come we aren't casting lots today to figure out important decisions? Well, this is an example without a command. There's nowhere in the New Testament that says use this method like they did in the Old Testament to figure out your decisions. And so we just don't make decisions like that. But it is an interesting thing to think about. Zechariah is chosen by lot. Now, in order to understand what Zechariah is going to do, you have to understand the temple. Now, Solomon had built a great temple, and it had been destroyed by the Babylonians. If you saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know all about how all that happened. When the people came back from exile, they built a smaller, cruder temple, the best they could do. The older people who remembered Solomon's temple wept because it was so pitiful compared to what it had originally been. Now, when Herod takes over at the Romans' behest, Herod says, you know, one thing I can do to make the people like me is to rebuild this old temple. And so over the course of about 60 years, they rebuild this thing from the bottom stone up. And it really is a pretty nice place. Maybe not as magnificent as Solomon's, but it is really something. It's more than 4 football fields large all the way around, 2 across and 2 long. Think about that, 4 football fields. We're not talking about some small thing. And when you think about the temple of God, I want you to understand that it emphasized God's holiness. God was approached once a year by the high priest in what was called the most holy place in the temple. And if you think of it as a bullseye target, there's the most holy place, then the holy place, then the priests, then the men, then the women, then the Gentiles. And in other words, you were allowed to go so far and no further depending on who you were and what your role was. And it was quite a magnificent thing. Jesus taught there. If you had gone to the temple and had entered, for instance, through the eastern gate, you would have come from the Mount of Olives, from the Garden of Gethsemane, and gone through that great gate. And what you would have seen surrounding the temple was called Solomon's porch, very much like the portico you walked up, a sidewalk with columns, except theirs was huge, all the way around, surrounding 4 football fields. We learn from the book of Acts that after the day of Pentecost, Christians used to meet in those porticos on Solomon's porch. If you went beyond that, you would come to the court of the Gentiles. That is, if you were a non-believer, If you were not a Jew, that's as far as you could go. And they have found warning signs at the temple, in the ruins there, that say things like this: no foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. So if you were a Gentile and you decided to go on in, you were taking your life in your hands if you went beyond the court of Gentiles. You would go through the gate called Beautiful. This is the gate where beggars, cripples, people with various ailments would beg for alms. You might recall in Acts chapter 3, Peter and John are going into the temple, and this is where they encounter a crippled man as they enter this gate. And then you would have entered the court of the women, a huge thing, magnificently furnished, most impressive. And in the distance was the gate of Nicanor. The gate of Nicanor was made entirely of bronze. It took 22 men to open it. And so as you can tell here, most of the time they didn't open it. You just went in one of the little side gates. The women could go this far and no further. If you went through the Nicanor gate, even the little one on the side, you came in to the court of men, the court of Israel. And this is where the men would bring their sacrifices, the lambs and the goats. But even they could only go so far before they had to turn their sacrifice over to a Levite who would kill it and hand it to the priest. And then way up on that big altar there on the upper left side is where they would be burned. Now this all seems very foreign to you and me, but this was a great deal of importance to the Jews of that time. Now, reminding what we left off, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. That means that whereas every other priest is out at the altar, is working with the animals, the Sea of Bronze was a huge bronze basin of water 15 feet across they would use to wash themselves and the animals. They're all working out there. But if you were very, very fortunate, your lot would be drawn and you could go into the temple itself. What a rare and magnificent thing. They say that priests would only be allowed to do it once in their lifetime. So I can only assume that Zechariah had never been in there before. If he had gone in there, it would have looked like this: magnificently covered in gold and bronze, and would have been very, very still and quiet, only the candles burning. In the distance up the stairs, you would see the curtain where you would enter the most holy place, which no priest was ever allowed to go in, only the high priest once a year. Back in Solomon's time, the Ark of the Covenant, the holy box that included the 10 Commandments of Moses on 2 stones, Aaron's rod that budded, a cup of manna, that was all in there. But at this time, there's nothing behind that curtain. It's an empty space. But nevertheless, they continued to treat it with great reverence, and you would never go beyond that point. The priest that was selected by lot was supposed to go to that little altar of incense in the center and offer the incense before God. That was his one and only task, and he only got to do it at most once in a lifetime, if that. And so Zechariah approaches it. It says, when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. The people knew what time the incense was supposed to be burned, and they were outside ready to worship. And then an angel of the Lord appeared to Zechariah standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. Most of us, when we think of angels, think of beautiful little cherubs. But there's hardly any reference to angels I can think of that don't include they are fearful. Zechariah is afraid. When this same angel appears to Mary 6 months later, she is afraid. When the angel appears to the shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth, they are terrified. When Jesus rises from the dead and angels appear before the Roman guards, they are so terrified they run away or just fall over fainting. Angels, although we might think of them as sweet little things here, whatever they were something more like that. Pretty attention-getting. It was not something, Zechariah's first impulse would not be to get a hug. Anyhow, the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah." Clearly the man is startled, afraid, trembling. Your prayer has been heard. In other words, he and Elizabeth had undoubtedly prayed their whole lives for a baby. And the angel says, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. Now with both John the Baptist and Jesus, the angel will tell each parent, this is the name this child should have. You don't get to name, normally in Jewish culture, the father would tell the name of the baby on the day he's born. But this is chosen for him. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, because he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink. And that's a tip-off as to exactly what kind of restrictions John the Baptist is going to live under. And he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring many of the people of Israel to the Lord, and he will go on before the Lord. He will be that herald before the king in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Now you and I would call him John in English, but in Hebrew it would be Yochanan. Yochanan means God is gracious. And names had meaning, great meaning for the people then. The second thing that the angel had told Zechariah is that his son was not to have any fermented drink. Now, what that refers to is something that the Jews had called the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow was something you would take if you wanted to devote a time, a week, 2 weeks, a month, just to be near to God, devoted to Him. And you would not cut your hair or your beard. You would not have any fermented drink. If you lived out in the country, that's okay because you might have a well to drink from. If you lived in the city where the water was iffy, wine was a pretty good thing to keep you from being sick, but you weren't allowed to have it if you had a Nazirite vow. You were not allowed to be around dead bodies. And so when we think about John the Baptist, he is going to look unusual. Now, I can't imagine having a little boy, 7 or 8 years old, whose hair I have never cut, much less someone who is in their 20s, whose hair and beard have never been cut. Now, I've seen ladies with hair all the way down below their waist, and I just marvel at how do you keep that clean? How do you manage that? I mean, I guess because not a lot of ladies have it, it is a very hard thing to do, I suppose. And in an era when bathing was, shall we say, more optional, it would have been quite something. A lot of olive oil and perfumes to deal with that. I can't imagine having a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old boy, sending him to synagogue school. He would have looked very strange compared to the other children. People knew who John was. This was a very unusual person and was meant to look that way. He was meant to attract attention. That's his whole purpose. Now, remember that the angel said that he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. And why that is so meaningful is because those are the last words in the Old Testament. 400 years before, that was the last inspired word God had given. And so when Zechariah hears those words, that's not some small thing. That means we are starting this up again. There's something very special about to happen. But Zechariah, and I don't blame him, Zechariah is an old man who is married to, shall we say, a woman of mature years. And he just can't wrap his mind around how this is going to work. He said, how can I be sure of this? Probably should not have said that. There are some things that you take on faith. And when the angel appears to Mary 6 months later, she isn't asking for a guarantee or a sign. Zechariah does, understandably so. He said, I'm an old man and my wife is well along in years. How can I be sure that this will happen? Because I'm going to leave here and I'm going to go home to the little woman and I'm going to explain this to her. This is going to be a hard thing. The angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. That means I'm not lying to you. I stand before God, and I've been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now, because you wanted a sign, all right, here's your sign. You will be silent and not able to speak until the day the baby is born, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. Now look, no blame on Zechariah. I probably would have done the exact same thing. But Zechariah is not going to be able to speak going forward. Gabriel, the angel says his name is Gabriel, which means God is great. He had appeared before in the book of Daniel. Zechariah would have known that. He appeared to Zechariah, he'll appear to Mary, and he's one of only 2 angels that are named in the Bible. The other is Michael, who is called an archangel. Now later on, in the Middle Ages, he'll have other things attributed to him. He'll become an archangel in Christian mythology, and he will be the one who blows the trumpet to signal the end of the world. But that's not in the Bible. So why was Zechariah rendered speechless? To silence his unbelief, to keep him from bragging or even sharing the news, and to give him a sign of remembrance and promise. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. Remember, all he had to do was light a little bit of incense and come out. And then his job was to give the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you, and His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face toward you and give you peace. And that was the blessing he was supposed to give as he left the temple. Every priest knew that. What is Zechariah doing in there? It is an awkward moment. And I'm sure the people and the priests look at each other like, we're not quite sure what we're supposed to do. Do we just wait here till nightfall? Do we draw another lot and send another priest in? Awkward things that are sometimes funny happen in church all the time. I'm going to close with these 2 or 3 stories. When I was newly baptized, it was my job to help pass out communion, which back before COVID you did individually in the trays up and down the pews. And you might remember that you had the little metal tray that had a doily and unleavened bread, usually a cracker on it. And I remember one of the first times it was my job to pass that out. I went to the first row, like where this gentleman is sitting in our old building, and there was a lady there I'd never seen before. She smiled at me, I smiled at her, I gave her the tray, she grabbed the whole thing, popped it in her mouth, and I'm left with an empty tray and a whole congregation still to have a little bit. And I did not quite know what to do. That was an awkward moment, and I had to put my head down and shuffle to the back and say, please, can I have some more bread? I remember one time when I was sitting in the pew and that same little tray with the doily and the cracker came to me, and there was a lady sitting, a little further than you can just hand it to them. And being a teenager, I kind of went like this, and that thing went Frisbee style, probably about 5 rows back, and hit a lady in the head and fell on the floor. And I had to get up and go back to the back and said, please, can I have some more bread? They must have thought I was retarded. There was a man up front one time, I remember. We would pass back then. The guy that was in charge of communion had been the head attaché for Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters unit as he moved through France and Belgium into Germany. So this guy thought in military terms. And so when we did communion, we marched in double file in phalanx down to the front and spread out, and we passed out that communion in military style. And I remember one fellow wasn't paying much attention, and he let his tray go like this, and the bread fell on the floor. Now, all the men in the audience were thinking, well, just pick it up and blow on it. But you know, every woman there was thinking, you pick that thing up, ain't none of us going to take it. And another awkward time. Randy told me a story. I'll close with this because I don't think you can top this. Randy told me a story one time where the song leader at the close of church was wanting a brother named Peabody to come and pray for the congregation and close out the service. And so with great solemnity, he said, and now Brother Praybody will come and pee for us. And those sorts of awkward moments are hard to believe. I believe that service ended that day with great laughter and no closing prayer. But despite all the laughter, this is a serious situation. What do we do with Zechariah? The man was supposed to go in, light incense, and come out, and he's not. They've got a problem. And we may talk about that next week, or we may talk more about the election. I'll have to think. But thank you all for coming tonight. Appreciate you being here.